Next, I want to talk a little bit about human use of water in California, or maybe people and water in California. So going back to the original inhabitants of California, Native Americans used the water resources but had very low impact to the natural water systems. Mostly they worked with the natural water systems, utilized them as a resource, and in some cases for small scale irrigation, but mostly for, they sort of worked along with the river systems, utilizing them for fish or water resources as they needed. And they primarily settled along the natural water courses or near some type of water resource, such as in the Tulare Lake, and utilized the resources where they were. And later we have the Spanish who come along in the 1700s, 1800s, and they used water supplies for their settlements. They had various presidios, missions, and pueblos. And they were granted temporary water rights by the Spanish government. That this wasn't like a, permanent right to the water, but they were granted access to whatever water resources they could utilize for small-scale farming, for missions and other settlements. And as the Spanish transitioned into the Mexican government in the 1800s, again, remember California was part of Mexico at that time, you had the development of ranchos, and these were areas of land that were granted their own water rights. A bit more involved development of water projects, but at a small scale compared to what we see today. So people could, these ranchos could be developed near water sources, and the water could be utilized for irrigation of smaller orchards and fields, and for cattle, for example. Now, once the California becomes part of the United States, and you have Anglo settlers, or settlers from the other parts of the United States, there was a different system of laws with individual water rights, and this started to cause a lot of chaos. There was a lot of fighting over individuals' rights to water supplies. There's kind of a famous saying attributed to Samuel Clemens that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And that is really, so in California history, there's been a long fight over competing water rights. Another use of water in California's early history was for hydrologic mining. This is where large amounts of water were used to wash away slopes to look for gold. As history moved on and people started to use water more for farming, you had what were called the water colonies. And this is where, so some of the early irrigation projects where settlers would pool their money and they would develop irrigation projects for farms. And so this is a 1914 map of Fresno County, and I've zoomed into the area near Clovis Community College. We're about right here, and you can see this is Garfield Colony, Perrin Colony, and these are small kind of projects where farmers would pool together and work and develop small ditches and canals for irrigation. Now, when we talk about competing water rights, just a little bit on that, originally people were granted riparian water rights, so that if you settled near a stream or a river, you would, if your land is next to it, you have the rights to the water there, that you can use the water from the river. That works fine if you're in part of California that has lots of running water, but if you're in the drier parts of California, they don't have the same type of access. So the challenge was for drier parts of California to try to get access to the water in the wetter parts of California. And so the competing right is the doctrine of prior appropriation. And this allowed for people to use water even if they didn't have property right next to rivers, for them to send it through ditches and canals, like in the colony system. And this is really kind of a first come, first served basis. If once someone had a claim to the water, then that was theirs, and, you know, kind of tough luck for the next person. And that kind of gave way to something called the California Doctrine, which is a kind of a complicated balance between riparian rights and other water users. So you know, California doesn't have enough streams to supply all the water needs. That not everybody can be next to a stream, so you can't just go with riparian rights. However, you do have to also honor the legal rights of people who had prior rights to and settled near rivers. So it's really a complex set of mess. And the short of it is that more water people have the rights to more water than exists in California, and that's always been the struggle. I just want to touch on a few of the major water projects in California. One of the earliest in the 1900s, after the San Francisco fire, that there was a real need to develop a water supply to San Francisco. San Francisco needed water, and there was a long, complex pipeline developed all the way from what's called Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, kind of near where Yosemite is. And see, it's up here, and it runs all the way into the Bay Area to San Francisco. This is gravity fed, that it starts high in the mountains, and just the gravity itself kind of moves the water all the way across the valley, all the way over to San Francisco. Now, one controversy over this is that the valley that they dammed for and built the reservoir on was like Yosemite Valley in a lot of ways. It was very Yosemite-like. And so now that is underwater. And there's been a push by some folks to try to develop alternative water resources for San Francisco and to restore the original Hetch Hetchy Valley. In Southern California, you had Los Angeles. Los Angeles, as it grew, quickly outstripped its local water resources. And so it's developed the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The Los Angeles Aqueduct was a really ambitious system to get water from Mono Lake and other parts of the Owens Valley and divert that water all the way down to Los Angeles. It's a whole long story. You know, if you've ever seen the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, that a lot of what that film is talking about is these days of development of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. In the Imperial Valley, way down here, you had the Salton Sea, and the Salton Sea was really, it was a low basin and a broken irrigation canal just kind of flooded into it. And it was really a mistake. It was a big flood event, and river flowed into a diversion canal and ended up filling up this little basin here. And it was great for a while. It used to be a vacation spot, but as it started to evaporate and concentrate a lot of pesticides, it's kind of a little bit of it's a big environmental problem now. And for all of these, I'll include an extra clip that goes into a little bit more depth. All right, and two of the other big projects were the Central Valley Project in the Great Depression, 1930s, 1940s. That's what built Millerton Lake and Frant Dam. And this is about expanding irrigated agriculture into the Central Valley. And following that, in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, you had the California State Water Project, which further extended irrigation into the southern and western part of the valley, and also down into Southern California. So here's a map here. The Central Valley Project, the big part of it was called the Friant-Kern Canal, which supplied water to the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. It also had a smaller Madera Canal, which went up north into Madera County. It also involved a number of around the town of Mendota, where it irrigates, and oddly enough, it's used to refill the San Joaquin River. The San Joaquin River, because they are diverting water from it here, actually goes dry for a stretch here. And because people had riparian water rights to the San Joaquin River, they actually had to use a different source to fill the river back up as it traveled further north. The other big one is the State Water Project, and it goes from around the Delta, extends to the west side through the California Aqueduct, and then down into Southern California. This figure shows it a little bit, some of the major features a bit better. It zooms in on the San Joaquin Valley, Kern Canal. It's the really long one that goes all the way from Norton Lake down to Bakersfield. And then the Madera Canal extends the water a bit further north into Madera County. You also had the Delta Mendota Canal from the Delta down to around the town of between Firebaugh and Mendota that refills the San Joaquin River. A few other various projects, and in red here is a State Water Project. It is both the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project for a stretch here. It's kind of both. It's called the San Luis Canal, and then continues as the California Aqueduct all the way down to Southern California. And to increase water supplies to the California Aqueduct and to try to avoid some of the problems with taking the water directly out of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, there's been an idea in the works for a long time to develop some type of canal that would take water directly from a river in the north down to the California Aqueduct. It was called the Peripheral Canal. Voters got to vote on it back in the 1980s, and they voted it down, but it's been resurrected lately. It was originally through the idea in the early 2000s or mid 2000s was to develop what they called the twin tunnels, two big tunnels to take water from up here down to the California Aqueduct. Very recently, that's been scaled back, and now the project is a single tunnel that's proposed to kind of move water from the north, cross the Delta to the south. From here, the water can go all the way down to Southern California.